Disc 6.
Paine's reply to the Reflections in general, and to the paean to Marie Antoinette in particular, is no less celebrated. In mourning the plumage, he wrote in Rights of Man, Burke forgot the dying bird. It is true, as O'Brien has pointed out, that this statement has since been employed by many pitiless revolutionaries to justify their less tasteful or unscrupulous actions, and that it can be made to rank with the omelette and the eggs as a remark that is dismissive and callous when applied to a mere individual. Indeed, in his essay in this edition, O'Brien proposes Burke as the moral ancestor of all those who have warned until the present day of the awfulness of absolutist revolutions, and of the terrifying results that ensue from any scheme for human perfectibility. However, Paine, who also disliked the mob and who described Lord George Gordon as a madman, was to take a much more considerable risk in theory and practice to assure humane treatment for the plumage. As a deputy in the French National Convention for the district of Pas-de-Calais, he spoke out strongly against the execution of King Louis. He did so first because of the way in which Royalist France had come to the aid of the American Revolution. Some historians, including Simon Schama, now maintain that the expense of this commitment led to the emptying of the French treasury, and thus to the original crisis of bankruptcy that precipitated the events of 1789. He did so second because he could see that measures of revenge were likely to coarsen the French revolutionary regime, and he did so third because of an inborn revulsion against capital punishment, which he had seen practiced with the utmost brutality by the British authorities. The taking of these positions, and let us not forget that the vote on the execution of King Louis almost resulted in a tie, involved him in a very tough parliamentary confrontation with none other than Jean-Paul Marat, who denounced Paine as a Quaker and a foreigner, and ignited the train of suspicion and paranoia that would land Paine in a foul-smelling Parisian cell under sentence of death. It was in such circumstances that Paine composed The Age of Reason. In that book, as is often forgotten, he tried to vindicate deism against atheism, and certainly succeeded in disproving Burke's crude contention that this was a distinction without a difference. For Paine, the Robespierrean annexation of religious property was not at all a separation between church and state, but rather a nationalizing by the state of the church. That may be a more radical and useful objection than Burke's furious refusal to regard the least trespass on ecclesiastical power as anything but profane or obscene. The chief weakness of this volume is its refusal to take Paine at all seriously, or to consider whether he too might not have been defending one revolution in his own way in order to safeguard another. O'Brien has established to most people's satisfaction that Burke pleaded the cause of the American colonists and indignantly denounced the French Revolution because he hoped in this way to make the case for reform in Ireland, and knew how far he could go. Paine, who had wanted the American Revolution to go further than it did, in the abolition of slavery, for example, wished to keep the French Revolution from becoming too bloody and fanatical. Like Jefferson and Lafayette, he had a not-so-hidden motive, to expand and consolidate a system that might rescue the new American Republic from isolation. Along with Lafayette, he suffered considerable persecution and contumely from French hardliners as a result. Professor John Keane has reminded us, in his 1995 biography of Paine, that there was a time when Burke and Paine were friends. Burke accompanied Paine on some trips into the English countryside in search of a site for Paine's newly designed iron bridge. Both were suspicious of arbitrary power. "We hunt in pairs," Burke once joked, and Paine had no reason to doubt that Burke, in his thoughts on the causes of the present discontents, 1770, had been sincere in his liberal belief that it was corrupt authority, not protest against it, that required justification. The astonishment Paine expresses in Rights of Man at Burke's refusal to criticize or even to enumerate the crimes and cruelties of the Ancien Régime is clearly genuine. So is his scorn at Burke's concept of the franchise as a reward for property and piety. Until Paine tried to salvage it, the term democracy, like the words Tory and later suffragette and impressionist, had been deployed only as an insult. Paine was a Newtonian and a believer in economic growth and modern technique. Burke was a prisoner of the feudal and the landed conception of society, who employed the words innovation and despotism as virtual twins. Notice, for example, how the word economist in the Marie Antoinette passage is used as a synonym for knavery. Paine was for a written constitution and a carefully designed welfare state, adumbrated in the second half of Rights of Man, whereas Burke was for the semi-mystical, unwritten constitution of a crowned parliament, and spared few thoughts even for the deserving poor. However often one awards the winning of the longer-term argument to Paine, the fact remains that he and Jefferson and Lafayette never even dreamed of the advent of Bonapartism. They all believed at the time that the argument was actually taking place, that France would become a constitutional monarchy, or had actually become one already. It was Burke who took this romantic delusion, a delusion shared by Charles James Fox and the leaders of Burke's own Whig Party, and even for a time by William Pitt and the more pragmatic Tories, and mercilessly exploded it. He also showed that the outcome of the French Revolution would be war on a continental scale. The tremendous power of the Reflections lies in this, the first serious argument that revolutions devour their own children and turn into their own opposites. Indeed, Marx might have paid a little more attention to Burke in drawing his conclusion that the French events of 1789 were the harbinger chiefly of a bourgeois revolution. Burke's attachment to the old order at least allowed him to see this with exemplary clarity. He wrote, "If this monster of a constitution can continue, France will be wholly governed by the agitators in corporations, by societies in the towns formed of directors of assignats and trustees for the sale of church lands, attorneys, agents, money jobbers, speculators and adventurers, composing an ignoble oligarchy founded on the destruction of the crown, the church, the nobility, and the people. Here end all the deceitful dreams and visions of the equality and rights of men." In a similar piece of magnificent disdain for what English aristocrats used to call trade, he made another penetrating observation about the kinship between tradition and the social contract. The state ought not to be considered as nothing better than a partnership agreement in a trade of pepper and coffee, calico or tobacco, or some other such low concern. It becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Each contract of each particular state is but a clause in the great primeval contract of eternal society, linking the lower with the higher natures, connecting the visible and invisible world, according to a fixed compact sanctioned by the inviolable oath that holds all physical and all moral natures, each in their appointed place. Again, one has to peel away the layers of holy awe with which Burke protected the idea of an ordained social and moral hierarchy, and the complacency of the hereditary principle in general. But something essential in him, not all of it attributable to his political allegiances, rebelled at the notion of a society begun anew, a place where humanity should begin from scratch. This is of huge importance, because Paine and Jefferson very adamantly took the view that only the living had any rights. "Man has no property in man," Paine wrote, making what could have been a very fine argument against slavery, but going on to say, "Neither has any generation a property in the generations which are to follow. The Parliament or the people of 1688 or of any other period has no more right to dispose of the people of the present day or to bind or to control them in any shape whatever than the Parliament or the people of the present day have to dispose of, bind or control those who are to live 100 or 1,000 years hence. Every generation is, and must be, competent to all the purposes which its occasions require. It is the living and not the dead that are to be accommodated." Thus, the French calendar that began the human story over again, or that at least tried to rewind its odometer. Thus Jefferson's notorious 1793 letter to William Short, stating that he had rather seen half the earth desolated were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country, than see the French Revolution defeated. A little stretch is required to derive the Khmer Rouge year zero from this, but those who are willing to be millennial about origins will sometimes be millennial about consequences. Yet such hectic and short-term radical enthusiasm is distinctly odd in one way, since both Paine and Jefferson derived many of their claims of liberty from supposedly ancestral Saxon institutions that predated the Norman conquest. And since Paine can hardly have been unaware that in challenging the 1688 revolution, he was pushing at an open door as far as Burke was concerned. Equally extraordinary is the implied lack of any duty towards future generations, which revolutionaries at all times have claimed to stand for. If modern conservatism can be held to derive from Burke, it is not just because he appealed to property owners on behalf of stability, but also because he appealed to an everyday interest in the preservation of the ancestral and the immemorial. And the abolition of memory, as we have come to know in our own time, is an aspect of the totalitarian that spares neither right nor left. In the cult of now, just as in the making of reason into an idol, the writhings of nihilism are to be detected. It is vastly to the credit of Connor Cruise O'Brien that he still feels it necessary to defend Burke from the charge of being a reactionary. It may not be feasible to make this extenuation a consistent one. Burke was strongly in favour of repressive measures at home, including the silencing of all dissent. In calling for an all-out war, he outdid William Pitt himself. He died before the worst of the Bonapartist project for Europe was revealed, and it cannot easily be said that his gravest fears in this respect did not materialize. But in his discussion of the French philosophes, he declined even to cite any of their secular and rationalist critique. Because, as he put it in a footnote to Reflections, "I do not choose to shock the feeling of the moral reader with any quotation of their vulgar, base and profane language." That's Tory pomposity defined. Furthermore, and as Darren McMahon points out in his chapter of this edition, Burke, in the year of his death, 1797, wrote to the exiled Abbé Bérulle to thank him in the most profuse terms for a copy of his Mémoires pour servir à l'histoire du jacobinisme. This was a work infamous in its time of the most depraved and retrograde Jesuitism, which purported to find a grand conspiracy of Freemasons and other subversives in the overthrow of the Bourbons. Burke's letter was no mere courtesy. It lauded the abbé for his justice, regularity, and exactitude. This is the only charge against Burke that I cannot find mentioned or dealt with in Connor Cruise O'Brien's tremendous biography, The Great Melody. But as O'Brien has observed in another context, those intellectuals who will not give up civility and objectivity for the cause of revolution have sometimes been observed to sacrifice these qualities for the sake of the counter-revolution. Clearly, Burke saw himself as willing to try all means and all alliances in order to contain revolutionary France, lest it pose a challenge similar to that presented by the Protestant Reformation, and then, as far as possible, to destroy it. By 1815, that project might have been accounted a success, but the idea of the French Revolution managed to survive the Duke of Wellington and Prince Metternich, as well as the literary power of Edmund Burke. The trinity of liberté, égalité, fraternité outlived those who had butchered in its name, and was deposed from the French currency only during the time of Vichy, which replaced it with the less sonorous travail, famille, patrie. Lafayette lived long enough to take part in the anti-Bourbon Revolution of 1830. Paine died ruined and disappointed, yet his opinions resurfaced in the movement for the franchise that eventually defeated the Duke of Wellington's government. And Thomas Jefferson was able to double the land area of the United States of America. The terms of the Louisiana Purchase would not have been available had it not been for a slave revolt in Haiti inspired by the ideals and proclamations of 1789, that annihilated Napoleon's fleet and army and put an end to French ambitions in the hemisphere. What might Burke have made of this momentous insurrection, later so brilliantly described by C.L.R. James? One recurs to Hazlitt's generous judgment when one wishes to have read Burke on what happened when Jacobinism crossed the Atlantic and became black.